So in November 1975, after leaving the sailing trip behind us, the four of us, Mark, Steve, Mel, and I, signed one-year contracts with Western Geophysical to help operate its fleet of 9 seismic research ships based in Southeast Asia. We were assigned to the Western Shoal, which was gearing up in Singapore for a 1-month job in Papua New Guinea. Steve was assigned as captain and I was assigned as mate. Mel and Mark would ride with us to New Guinea, where they'd be transferred to the Western Islander and Oil Creek, already stationed there. The trip was about 3,300 nautical miles, so at a speed of 10 knots, it would take about 2 weeks, heading south from Singapore into the Java Sea, past Jakarta and Bali, south of Sulawesi and the Spice Islands, north of Timor, through the Torres Strait and into the Gulf of Papua New Guinea. We would use the 2 weeks to learn the boat, the navigation and comm systems, engine room, safety equipment, and get as familiar as we could with seismic operations. We were told that the ship would be manned by a boat crew and a seismic crew. The normal-sized boat crew was the captain, mate, 1 AB, 1 engineer, and a cook. The seismic crew was the project coordinator, assistant coordinator, 2 computer techs, 2 gunners, and 12 seismic technicians. The term seismic technicians, in my mind anyway, meant a bunch of scientists with white lab coats and clipboards, quietly recording seismic data. Man, was I wrong. These guys were raggedy and looked half nuts. They came from all around the world: Brits, Kiwis, Chinese, Australians, Indonesian, Malay, Rhodesian, South African, and Irish. We even had a Swedish cook. The only American was the engineer, a guy from Port Arthur, Texas named Bubba. I don't know how these guys ended up on this boat, and I didn't want to know. But considering we were all packed together on a 150-foot ship for weeks at a time, we actually got along pretty well. The actual seismic operation was pretty straightforward. Western Geophysical would contract with an oil company like Shell, Phillips, and Amoco to survey an area where the client suspected oil or gas was hidden under the seabed. The seismic ship would shoot lines on a predetermined grid, sending sound signals into the seabed and recording the reflections coming back up. To do this, the crew deploys a seismic cable about 1 mile long that is towed behind the ship. The cable is made up of electronic wiring and hydrophones suspended in oil that pick up sound signals and transmit the data to the ship data control center. So-called birds placed on the cable keep it at a constant depth of 6 to 10 feet under the surface. A buoy with a radar reflector attached to the end of the cable lets the navigator keep track of the cable to avoid other ships and fishing boats. As the ship moves down each line, explosions are set off about every 8 seconds using propane oxygen guns that are lowered into the water on each side of the ship. As the sound wave goes down through the seabed, sudden changes in density will cause some part of the sound signal to reflect back up. The greater the change in density, where oil or gas is likely present, the stronger the reflection. All this data is stored on reel-to-reel tapes in the computer data center. At the end of the job, the tapes are boxed up and shipped back to Houston for analysis and ultimate delivery to the client. During shooting, it's the job of the mate on watch to maintain a steady speed, about 5 knots, and to keep as close to the grid line as possible. To do this, they use sat-nav, something I'd never heard of before. It was this TV screen in the wheelhouse, showing a constant update of numbers, like latitude, longitude, gyro heading, speed through the water and over the ground, and distances and rates of drift off the track. This was based on data from a satellite system being developed by the U.S. military in the early 1970s that would fix your position accurate to within 10 meters from electromagnetic signals received from orbiting satellites. This later became Navstar in 1978 and then GPS, but it wasn't released to the public until the 1980s, embedded with code that made it much less accurate. But there it was, in a wheelhouse, unembedded, courtesy of the U.S. Department of Defense. Because you needed 3 or 4 satellites for a fix, and in 1975 there were only a handful of satellites up in the sky, sometimes you could go an hour or so without a good fix. So to fill the gap, they also used something called SHORAN, short-range navigation, developed during the Korean War to guide bombers to their targets. It was a series of 3 transponder stations set up in a triangle around the job site, usually on remote hilltops, to send radio signals back to the ship. Each transponder was manned by one operator who would set up camp and live at the station for the duration. The SHORAN operator on the ship would watch an oscilloscope and relay data to the mate on watch. These SHORAN guys were from Australia, and all of them had this crazy look in their eyes like they'd spent too much time in the bush. The trip through the Java Sea was kind of magical. Beautiful islands, small fishing boats, and larger sailing vessels carrying lumber and copra. Port Moresby is the capital of Papua New Guinea, which gained independence from Australia in 1975, just a few months before we arrived. There are 840 languages spoken there, the most of any nation in the world. The city was busy, with lots of street markets, and people seemed to be excited about their newly found independence. We docked at the cargo pier right near downtown, and spent a couple of days resupplying the ship and taking on the shore-end crew for the upcoming job. We met up with the Western Islander in the Oil Creek near the mouth of the Fly River and transferred gear, supplies, and some crew, including Mel and Mark. The crews on the 3 boats all knew each other, so there was a lot of catching up and storytelling. We hired a local riverboat to guide the Islander and Oil Creek up the Fly River. Meanwhile, we headed for our job site near the mouth of the river. That was the last I saw of Mark and Mel until years later, after I had returned to the States. I found out later that they stayed with Western Geophysical for a couple of jobs around Java, then quit in Singapore. They traveled through Sumatra and Java for a few months, visiting places like Padang, Borobudur, and Lake Toba. They even took a freighter through the Sunda Strait and got a glimpse of Krakatoa, the island volcano that blew up in 1883 and killed 36,000 people. They ended up in Bali, where they split up. Mel took a freighter back to Singapore and then home. Mark went on to Australia. Anyway, back in New Guinea, the Western Shoal anchored down and started setting up the SHORAN stations. The coordinator, a guy named Ken from Australia, a real hard ass, took a few crew and went in to meet the village chief, just to make sure we were welcome. We then started loading gear into the skiff and shuttling it to the beach. At first, the locals stayed away, but gradually they started coming out to give us a hand. First the men, then the kids. The gear included a generator, transmitter, antenna, and a month's worth of fuel and water. Everybody seemed friendly and curious. We were told some of the younger kids had never seen white people before. One kid even showed us how to get a pig to lay down, something I couldn't really get the hang of. So this took a better part of a day. Then we moved on to the other SHORAN stations. We stayed on the job site for about a month, then headed back to Port Moresby to drop off the SHORAN crew. This is where Steve decided to get off and head back to Singapore. I guess he had had enough. So this left me in charge as captain. And we also got a new mate in Port Moresby, a guy named Buzzy from Houston, Texas. He had worked for Western for a time in the Gulf of Mexico. Gulf of America. And he'd just been transferred out. We would become fast friends in the coming months. It was now the end of December, and we headed to Surabaya on the north coast of Java for our next job in the Java Sea. This time, we decided to head south into the Indian Ocean to avoid Timor, where a violent civil war had just started while we were in New Guinea, following the Portuguese withdrawal from East Timor and subsequent brutal crackdown by the Indonesian government on the independence movement. The trip took us through the Lombok Strait between Bali and Lombok, where the Pacific Ocean dumps into the Indian Ocean and creates 20-foot standing waves, even in calm weather. This is also the location of the Wallace Line, which separates the vegetation and animal life of the Indo-Malayan region from the completely different vegetation and animal life of the Australasia region, which explains why you don't get tigers and elephants in Australia and why you don't get kangaroos in India. Surabaya is the second largest city in Indonesia, a major trading port in the 15th century connecting the Spice Islands to the Middle East. Indonesia, with the largest Muslim population in the world, gained independence from the Dutch after World War II. In 1976, the country was run by General Suharto, following a military coup against the previous communist government. After clearing customs and immigration, the crew took a few days off to enjoy the sights and nightlife. The city was full of these bicycle rickshaws, their version of taxis, that would take you anywhere you wanted for almost nothing. One night, after a few beers, Buzzy and I got a couple of them to race each other up and down the main drag for just a few extra ringgits. The ship reloaded and got ready for the next series of jobs along the north coast of Java. This would keep us busy for the next 3 months, and included stops in Tanjung Priok, the port city for Jakarta, and Merak, right across the Sunda Strait from Krakatoa. To help the boat crew, we hired a new AB, a local Indonesian guy named Sam, who promised to teach Buzzy and me Indonesian if we would teach him English. On a job site, the coordinator was in charge of everything, including the movement of the ship. In transit, to and from the job site, the captain was in charge. At all times, the captain had the final say when it came to the safety of the boat and crew. That's the way it was explained to us anyway. So on the first job with me as captain, the coordinator, Ken, who had already butted heads with Steve, decided to test my authority right off the bat. We had to shoot a few lines for a client real close to shore, and one of them ran right down the middle of some fish houses, full of fishermen and their families. With a mile-long cable behind you, you really can't maneuver. Ken was in the wheelhouse with me as we approached the first house. We passed less than 100 feet off, with propane guns blasting away every 8 seconds. Through binoculars, I could see the people in the next house start to panic and run around. We got within a ship length, and I said, "We're done," and looked at Ken and said, "Pick up your cable." He gave me this icy stare, and then left the wheelhouse. After that, though, we got along fine. Over the next few weeks, I got better at the job, and the company had growing confidence in me. The shooting was going well. Everyone was getting along. Sometimes I helped out with the cable on the back deck, and I even got some of the seismic crew to help us with the deck maintenance. I soon learned that as captain, I was also the ship's medical officer. With no medical training whatsoever, and with only some kind of physician's manual, I started diagnosing and treating various ailments. This included giving these guys stitches every time they banged up their feet because they were wearing those stupid flip-flops. I finally had enough and posted a notice in the galley that only proper steel-toed work shoes could be worn on deck. Well, word got back to the head office, and I was told to back down. Too many guys were upset, so I took the notice down. I also got pretty good at bribing port officials every time we came in or out of port. Usually a carton of cigarettes and a bottle of Johnny Walker would do it. Either that, or you end up sitting at anchor for a week. Speaking of flip-flops, one night off the island of Belitung, we had to drift for a few hours while the seismic crew performed maintenance on different segments of the cable. The boat was suddenly surrounded by sea snakes. I mean hundreds of them. It was mating season. Using the spotlight, I could see them wrapping around each other. and these were poisonous. One bite and you're dead in 5 minutes. No antidote. We had a camera on the back deck, and while I was watching, a snake wound up the cable and landed on deck. These guys scattered in all directions. I've never seen them move so fast. The different port visits gave us a chance to travel around the country a bit. Outside of town, it was beautiful, and the people were really friendly. Everywhere you look, there was a volcano, rice paddies, beautiful fields, lakes, and beaches. During one of these port visits, something went really bad. A few of us went to a bar in Tanjung Priok down near the docks. The Chinese Malay guy named Dickie got drunk and decided to get into a fight with these Filipino seamen. He threw off his shoes and took some kind of kung fu stance. One of them just broke a bottle across his face. This big fight broke out. When the police came, they took both groups to this rundown hospital, where they were stupid enough to put us in the same room while Dickie got 30 stitches to his face and one of the Filipinos got stitches to his arm. We almost got in another fight. Dickie was flown back to Singapore the next day, and I never saw him again. So it was the end of March. We had just finished our last set of lines and we were heading back into Surabaya to unload. Navigating up the Surabaya Channel at night was difficult enough, but this time there was a swarm of fishing boats all around the channel. On the radar, I couldn't tell the difference between the fishing boats and the channel buoys. There was one buoy in particular that marked a submerged wreck on the right side of the channel, and I just couldn't see it. When I finally saw it with a spotlight, I could see that the buoy's light wasn't working and we were outside the channel. Just then, bang, we hit the submerged wreck. We stopped the engines, anchored down, checked for any leakage or oil spill, and called the authorities. In the morning, we were able to limp into port using one propeller and one rudder, and went straight to dry dock. The port side propeller was mangled, and the port rudder was jammed up into the hull. The company laid off the whole crew and flew them back to Singapore. I had to go before the Indonesian Board of Inquiry and explain what happened. The company ordered me and the engineer Bubba to bring the ship back on our own to Singapore for dry dock and repairs. Because Bubba really couldn't stand a watch, I had to take enough amphetamines to stay awake for 3.5 days. Back in Singapore, I crashed for the night at the Ambassador Hotel, where the company put up crews. I went into the head office. They told me they didn't hold me responsible, but they also told me to take a week off. So the next day, I hopped on a Garuda flight and headed to Bali. What makes Bali so interesting is it's the only Hindu community in Indonesia, heavily influenced by Indian and Chinese culture during the first century. In the 1970s, tourism took hold in Bali, following the anti-communist political upheavals of the 60s. Mainly from Australia and Europe, the tourists centered around the capital Denpasar and Kuta Beach, where you could rent a beach hut for $1 a day and stroll around the local shops and restaurants. For breakfast, you can even have one of their special omelets, made with hallucinogenic mushrooms. I hung out around the beach for a few days and tried my hand at surfing. Then I decided to run a motorcycle and travel around the island for the rest of the time. It was nice to get out on my own and travel around a bit. For months I had been living in close quarters with 20 other guys, so this was a chance to kind of clear my head. I stayed at different bungalows around the island and tried to take in what Bali had to offer. Beautiful countryside, rice paddies, Hindu temples, religious rituals, lots of culture, active volcanoes, and of course, monkeys. Back in Singapore, the Western Shoal was still in the yard finalizing repairs. The city was bustling and going through a lot of changes. I divided my time between the Ambassador Hotel and the ship, getting ready for the next trip. Buzzy and the rest of the boat crew were now back, and in the evenings we would head out to the restaurants and clubs, where the 70s disco scene was now in full swing. Man, did they like the electric slide in Funky Town. It was on one of these outings that I met Ida, a Singaporean Malay who was working as a social hostess at the Shangri-La Hotel nightclub. We talked a lot and decided to see each other again. She lived in a high-rise with her parents, 3 sisters and 2 brothers. Her father was a police officer. We even went on a double date with Buzzy and her sister Ruby. But we were both off on our next job and promised to see them again when we got back. By mid-April, the whole Seismic crew was back and we were ready for our next assignment. The main job would last about a month and was in the northern part of the Gulf of Thailand. We would use Bangkok as our base. Thailand is the only country in Southeast Asia to avoid colonization, and for the last 100 years has been going back and forth between a constitutional monarchy and military rule. During that time, it's had 20 different constitutions. It has the second largest Buddhist population in the world, after China. Bangkok's a bustling port city located about 15 miles upriver from the Gulf of Thailand. With a lot of connecting rivers and canals, it's called the Venice of the East. Bangkok is known for its street life and cultural sites, but in the 70s, it was best known for its nightclubs and red light district, which thrived on servicing U.S. military on leave during the Vietnam War. I mean, it was insane. So after a few days in port, my job as ship's doctor now expanded into administering shots of tetracycline to the crew. At times, they were lined up outside my cabin, begging for a shot. At one point, Buzzy and I took the opportunity to explore the city, checking out the temples and historical sites. We even rented a car and headed inland to see the countryside and nearby villages. One thing that was really cool were the markets in entire towns situated right on the rivers. People would bring their goods downriver by boat and sell them right there, and a lot of them lived right on the river. After about a month on the job, we headed down to Songkhla, down in the southwest corner of the country, to do a small job on our way back to Singapore. This is one of the coolest places I've ever seen, situated just inside this inlet, right on the ocean. Absolutely beautiful. Then we got this message from the head office to do one last job in the Gulf. Only this one was for an undisclosed client and was secret. It was only 3 lines, and we were instructed to do it at night with lights off. They gave us the coordinates. I plotted them on the chart, and they were 10 miles off the coast of Cambodia, clearly in Cambodia waters. At that time, we knew Cambodia was sealed off, with no news going in or out, but we didn't know what was going on there. We waited until night, turned the lights off, and set the cable. During the second line, Buzzy woke me up in a panic. He had seen a red flare shoot across our bow, and there was nothing on the radar. I went up to the wheelhouse and stayed there for a couple of hours. Couldn't see anything, so we kept shooting. Then we did see something on the radar, but we couldn't see anything visually. All of a sudden, this large military ship, completely blacked out with no lights, appeared out of nowhere and slowly passed about 100 yards ahead of us. The coordinator and I looked at each other, and he gave the order to pick up the cable. We were getting out of there. It wasn't until months later that the world found out what was happening in Cambodia. Pol Pot, leader of the Khmer Rouge, had taken over and was committing genocide on his own people, imprisoning and re-educating the middle class, resulting in 2 million deaths. When we got back to Singapore, Buzzy and I spent a lot of time with Ida and Ruby. We got to know their family and even took a trip to Malaysia with the whole family to visit their grandparents and relatives. We both stopped eating pork, and their father and uncle even took us to their mosque in Malaysia and taught us how to properly attend service and pray to Allah. Before leaving on our next trip, Buzzy decided to leave the boat. He fell in love with Ruby and said he planned to convert to Muslim, marry her, and bring her back to Houston. I asked him if he was really sure that's what he wanted to do, and he said, "Hell yeah." So it was the middle of July, and it was time to leave for my last job with the company. This started with a 3-week shoot off the island of Natuna, right in between Malaysia and Borneo. One thing I remember about this place is the main village was built on sticks and extended quite a ways out into the bay. It was then on to the Philippines for a 2-month assignment in the Visayan Sea. We were told to clear customs and immigration at Cagayan de Sulu, a remote outpost near the southern tip of the Sulu Sea. There were no dock facilities, so the boarding officials came out to meet us at anchor in an outrigger. At first, they refused to meet with me because I was too young to be captain. When I showed them my license and the entry documents, they finally agreed. Bribes were still the normal routine, but this time they didn't want alcohol and cigarettes. They were short on medical supplies and wanted syringes, antibiotics, and morphine. I gave them half of what we had. It was then on to Cebu and Iloilo. Cebu is the oldest city in the Philippines, developed as a trading post by the Spanish in the early 1500s. In fact, the name Cebu comes from the ancient Sanskrit word for trade. It is said to be the birthplace of Christianity in the Far East, and the place where Ferdinand Magellan was clubbed to death when he decided to take on Chief Lapu-Lapu and the tribes of Mactan Island in 1521. So Magellan never completed the first circumnavigation of the world, but some of his crew did. We took on supplies in Cebu, and because this job required shore-ran, we sailed over to Iloilo to pick up the shore-ran crew and their equipment. Then it was on to the Visayan Sea. Once again, the locals were happy to help us get the equipment ashore and set up the stations. We then shot lines for 2 months, taking a week off here or there to go back to Cebu to resupply and give the crew a break. The scenery in this area of the Philippines was stunning. Rugged mountains, thatch roof villages, all types of cool sailing vessels, and huge outriggers passing nearby, and beautiful sunsets. I forgot to mention, I had a monkey named Oscar. In Singapore, a captain from another Western ship asked me to take care of his monkey while he went back to the States for a couple of weeks. Well, the guy never came back, so Oscar would snatch packs of cigarettes from people's pockets and throw them overboard. One day he got loose in the galley and the cook tried to kill him with a cleaver. The next day the company told me to get rid of him, the monkey, not the cook. So I gave him to a resort in the Philippines. One day in port, I was exploring the neighborhoods outside Cebu, and I heard a large cheering crowd. It was Sabang, a cockfighting arena. Long part of the Filipino culture, it was now regulated under the cockfighting law of 1974. The place was packed, a loud, festive atmosphere where you could spend the day eating and drinking, and betting. People would bring their best fighting birds to the arena, and they'd be paired up against each other. A razor-sharp blade was attached to the leg of each bird, and it was a fight to the death. For each fight, the handlers would present the birds to the crowd, and the betting would start. Lots of shouting, hand signals, and lots of money changing hands. Then it got quiet. The handlers would poke and prod the birds at each other to get them riled up, and then the fight was on. It didn't last long. When it was over, the owners would collect their birds, and everybody would get ready for the next fight. Back in Singapore, I left the company. My contract was up. For tax reasons, I needed to stay out of the U.S. for a couple more months, so I moved in with Ida's family. By this time, Buzzy was already gone. He had married Ruby in a Muslim ceremony in Malaysia, and they moved back to Texas. I paid half the rent, bought some of the groceries, and occasionally took Ida's mom shopping or to a movie. One of Ida's sisters had disabilities, but the family took special care of her, and she seemed to like me a lot. We spent some of the days hanging out in the parks, playing guitars, and going to the beach. They all helped me improve my Malay because that's all we spoke, and they laughed at me whenever I mispronounced something. Well, the days went by, and pretty soon it was time for me to say my goodbyes. I missed home, I missed my family, I missed hearing American accents, and I missed simple things like a ham and cheese sandwich on rye and watching a New York Giants game with my father. I told Ida that I'd like to see her again. She just gave me a kiss and said I would marry an American girl and never come back again. I grabbed a taxi and headed to the airport. Right after taking off, I looked out the window and was able to see the islands I sailed to with Mark, Mel, Steve, and John. It seemed like so long ago that we were there, I just smiled and fell asleep. It felt good to be back home. I'd been gone for over a year and a half. While I was away, both my grandfathers passed away, my sister had a baby, and we elected a new president, bringing some sense of decency back to the White House. I hugged my family and hung out with my brothers and sisters. The doctor said I had a few issues, but overall, I was lucky. I found out later that Buzzy's marriage to Ruby didn't work out, and she went back to Singapore. I kind of lost touch with him, and I feel bad about that. My old coach, Gary Jobson, got me a job coaching sailing at the Naval Academy. I raced on the 12-meter Courageous with Ted Turner for the America's Cup training sessions. While coaching for Navy up in Martha's Vineyard, I managed to get in the movie Jaws 2. They gave us a case of beer for it. I worked on ships long enough to get enough money to go to law school. Got a job with a maritime law firm in New York City. And I'd had turned out to be right. I did meet an American girl, got married, and never did see her again. Had a baby, and then had another, and we raised a good family. I did a lot of ocean racing, got to play in a bunch of rock bands, and even played once at the Stone Pony. Went fishing in Alaska, hiked in the Canadian Rockies, ate dinner on the Colorado River, watched the Giants win the Super Bowl, and finally got to Daytona. I stayed in touch with my classmates at Kings Point. After 36 years, I retired. Played a lot of golf, built a deck, moved to Connecticut, got a dog, stayed close to the family, and got together with Mark from time to time and had a few laughs about our trip. Thinking back on my life, it was this trip to Singapore when I was 21 that kind of grounds me and gives me strength, especially when times get tough. It's kind of funny how that is. If I learned anything, it's when someone comes up with an idea, as long as it's not totally crazy, just do it.